it is right here. Miss King, this is one of my childhood friends right here. Oh, here we are, right here.
Tremendous conference, bro.
Thanks a lot, but
It's really tremendous.
but you add value. I can't wait to hear you speak. Are you ready? We're gonna go up. Hey, how you doing? Ma'am.
Is he moderator? Oh. I was like, what are we doing?
Now, be careful with that cord right there.
Okay.
Dr. Robert Sugar. All right, everybody, you ready for part two? All right, we're going to get started. We're just a tad bit behind schedule. And so what I'm going to do is begin with the introductions of our speakers. Starting with Dr. Dorothy Roberts. Dr. Dorothy Roberts is an author, scholar, sociologist, researcher, and social justice advocate. She is a Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor, George A. Weiss University Professor, and inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Tan Nirmaso Alexander Professor of Civil Rights at the University of Pennsylvania. She holds appointments there in the Law School and Department of Africana Studies and Sociology. Her books include Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, where she describes the use of Norplant and other contraceptives in population control. Shattered Bonds, To Color Child Welfare, and Fatal Invention. How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, as well as 6 co-edited works on constitutional law and gender. In 2022, she published Torn Apart, in which she details a case for abolishing the child welfare system, which she calls the family policing system, as part of a prison abolition movement. She also has published over 100 articles and essays in books and scholarly journals, including the Harvard Law Review, Yale Law Journal, and Stanford Law Review. Her TED Talk on the problem with race-based medicine has over 1 million views. Dr. Joy DeGruy is a nationally and internationally renowned researcher, educator, author, and presenter. Her seminars have been lauded as the most dynamic and inspirational, currently being presented on the topics of culture, race relations, and contemporary social issues. She is a Tell It Like It Is ambassador for healing and a voice for those who struggle in search of the past and continue to struggle through the present. Dr. DeGruy is the author of the groundbreaking book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing, which addresses the residual impacts of trauma on African descendants in the Americas. Shireen White is the Director of Advocacy and Policy at Children's Rights. Shireen joined Children's Rights in 2019 and in 2021 transitioned from a senior staff attorney to lead CR's Children's Rights Advocacy and Policy work. Her work focuses on expanding community and organizational partnerships to collectively reimagine systems impacting youth and families. Prior to joining Children's Rights, she represented the School District of Philadelphia in Special Education Matters as an Assistant General Counsel. Shireen also represented children involved in the child welfare system as a child advocate attorney at the Defender Association of Philadelphia. Please welcome our guests for Torn Apart, the Community Dialogue. So I have some books right there. If you can bring me those books. Torn Apart. Dr. Roberts did a phenomenal job in laying the foundation for this particular work. That's it. This conversation that we're going to have. And so we're going to just build on some of those points that you've raised, Dr. Roberts. And I want to kind of talk about a couple things. One is that you mentioned that there's a carceral approach to working with particularly black children, youth, and family. In our particular community in Milwaukee County, 63% is my understanding, 63% of the children who are represented in our local foster care system are black. Statistics that you shared is that 53% of black children will be involved in a CPS investigation by the time that they reach their 18th birthday. We have some racial disproportionality issues, and so we have a history of trauma, a conflicted history of working with law enforcement and child protective services. Can you talk about what are some of the things that stand out in terms of that's preventing us from being able to trust these systems that's working with our family and saturating our community?
Thanks for that question.
Is your mic on?
Oh, it's on. Maybe it can just be turned
You know
up
what?
some more.
Let's switch. Let's switch. I'll take yours if you let me have yours.
Okay. Here, I'll let this
Okay,
gentleman.
double check it. Excuse my reach.
Okay, so for now, I'll talk in here. So as I was hoping to convey in my talk earlier, the system is structured in a way to interfere with a trusting relationship. You know, so often when we talk about black people don't trust various systems, black people don't trust the police, black people don't trust the healthcare system, black people don't trust science, black people don't trust social workers, it's as if there's a problem with us. If only we were more trusting, then we'd get better health care. If only we were more trusting, we could be involved in more medical experiments, or testing. If only we were more trusting, we would get better protection from the police. If only we were more trusting, we would get better social services. As if there's something innate in black people that makes us suspicious. Sometimes it's almost framed as if there's something innately wrong with us, that we are suspicious people, or we're ignorant. We don't realize the good we would get if we will take advantage of anything opportunity we have. I mean, the history of black people in America is that we have fought to get the opportunities that other people have. We have fought. In the case of healthcare, I often give the example, the people who will fight doctors the most to keep grandma on life support, black people. We're not afraid of medical technology. We will use it. And speaking with our wanting to know more about our history, black people use technologies to try to find more about our ancestors all the time. So we're not afraid of anything. In fact, sometimes the stereotype is then twisted to say, well, black people will cheat the system to gain it. So it's like we can't win. We're suspicious, but we're ignorant about what the opportunities. We don't want to use the opportunities, but yet we'll cheat the system to get the opportunities. So these are all just stereotypes that mask the truth, which is that these systems are structured in a way that creates our mistrust. Our mistrust is based on history and experience, and we understand the way these systems work. And so when it comes to the child welfare system, it is structured largely through mandated reporting, which in a way that makes people distrustful of it, because people know, as I mentioned, you live in any black neighborhood, you are going to be aware of how the systems work, whether we're talking about the prison system, the police system, the child welfare system. You are well aware of how these systems work. You've either had experience with it, or you have a friend or a relative who's had experience with it. And so you know that you are at risk of a negative outcome if you engage with the system. And you don't have to have studied all the studies like I've studied. I've read all the studies about the outcomes of foster care, and they all show bad outcomes. Not for everybody. There are people who survive foster care and thrive. There are many people who do, but it's not because of the system. It's usually because somebody gave them an opportunity, somebody showed care for them, somebody helped them to survive it and to thrive. The system itself, though, is not structured that way, and that's what the studies and statistics show, that the outcomes are poor for people who have experienced this system. So, Black people know that. And so they also know that mandated reporters who are told to report their suspicions often report them based on prejudice and stereotype. Again, I know there may be people out here, probably many people out here are mandated reporters. If you work with children at all, you probably are a mandated reporter. And I'm not trying to say anything about any individual. I'm saying that it's structured. In fact, this isn't about individuals. It's about the way it's structured. It's structured to tell people to report suspicion. So if you are living in a Black neighborhood and you are well aware of the high rates of investigation, high rates of child removal, high rates of termination of parents' rights, and you also know about the bias in it, you know that when a child strays away from a Black mother, or when a Black mother has a problem with drugs, or when a Black mother may be subjected to domestic violence, or a Black mother has an issue with a mental health problem or health problem with her child, you know that the system's going to come down on her in a way it's not going to come down on someone living in a wealthy white neighborhood. You know that. So therefore, you have a well-reasoned suspicion and mistrust of what's going to happen to you if you go into a hospital, a social service program, a school, with a problem you have. It is structured to produce that suspicion. And again, we know that what happens, we have studies, you can talk to people. It just makes common sense that if you know there's a risk of a bad outcome if you go to someone with a problem, you are going to be deterred from going to that person for a problem. This is one of the reasons why this system is harmful, because it actually deters people from getting help. And it turns the people who have the training to help, instead of helping, they're told report. Instead of figuring out how can teachers provide better support for families in schools? How can doctors provide better support for families in clinics? How can social service programs provide better support for families? That's not what the focus is. How can you report them? Those are contradictory. And again, ending mandated reporting doesn't prevent anybody from reporting. It just means you're not coerced into, instead of helping, reporting people. So it actually is better for supporting families to end it. It's better to protect children by ending it. Seems counterintuitive because we've been taught report your suspicions. But just, if you haven't thought about this, think about it just logically. Just think logically. Wouldn't it be better to encourage people to come to places that could be helpful, to say what their problems are so they could get help, than to have a system that makes people afraid to do it? And also that disincentivizes actually providing the supports, because the reporting system seems like a replacement for that. And so it's structured in a way, again, to make people distrustful. And I could apply the same logic to police officers. When you, I feel like I don't even need to say it, because we all know. If you didn't know before the last few years, all you have to do is look at the news and see all the people. It seems like every day I hear another story about somebody who called the police for help and ended up killed by the police. Just, black people are more likely to experience that. But just the other day, I heard a story about a white man who called the police. He is having trouble with his car. They came at him, and he wouldn't get out the car because he was scared to death. And they killed him through the car window. They shot him to death. He called for help. How many stories do we know of black mothers who called the police for help for their child who was experiencing some kind of crisis, and the child ends up killed? So you know that you are just clearly going to be wary of seeking help from the police. And so, same thing with intimate partner violence. This is so well documented that many people remain in violent situations because they're afraid to call for help, either because they're afraid that the police will kill their partner, whom they may love and not want to be killed. They just want help to end violence in their home, or that someone will come and take their children from them.
So let's talk about that for a minute. Domestic
Sure.
violence, intersectionality between black women and domestic violence.
Yes.
CPS.
Sure.
So statistics show that 45.1% of black women experience physical violence, sexual violence, or stalking from their intimate partner, while 40.1% of black men experience those abuses. So on average, 1 out of 3 women will experience domestic violence, and 1 out of 4 experience domestic violence, showing that African Americans are disproportionately affected by this issue of intimate violence. So I just want to do an experiment here. How many mothers of young children do we have here in the room? Okay, could you stand just for 1 second? Just a little demonstration, interaction. Okay.
Yeah, where's young?
Okay,
I have a 22-year-old.
22 ain't young, okay. But you still living at home and you still paying his bills.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I'm paying college tuition.
Okay. So with that being said, dear mothers, if you were presented with a situation where you were experiencing domestic violence, and if you were to contact local organizations, shelters for women or battered women, and there's a mandated reporting policy, and you can understand, or you have the understanding that if you report this abuse that you're experiencing, that these folks are going to contact CPS and your children could be removed from you. How many of you would willingly seek out that assistance knowing that you could possibly lose your children? For those who will go ahead and contact the police and contact local organizations, stay standing, everybody else sit down.
Who would, what do we, if we would stand if he would not?
Okay, you stand alone, but it's okay. It's okay, we're gonna get you the help you need. So with that being, so understand that, because this is something that happens every single day. So when we ask the question, why do women stay in abusive relationships? Because some women would risk dying than to physically be separated from their children. So when we talk about domestic violence and how impactful and pervasive it is in the community, how do we address that? Because there's safety plans. What do we need to do in child welfare to address this? Because oftentimes domestic violence is a gateway to foster care.
Yes. So in many places, I don't know what the policies are in Milwaukee, but in many places, calling for help is an admission to child neglect. Calling for help for domestic violence is an admission to child neglect. Even if your child did not see the violence, did not experience it, is getting good care in the home, but you are being beaten. That alone, in many places, is considered admission to being an unfit parent. And so you are risking, as you said, you're risking having an investigation. And I actually begin one of the chapters in Torn Apart about a mother in New York City who called a domestic violence hotline she saw advertised in the buses. And as soon as she said she had a little boy in the home, everything focused on what's your address? Has he been harmed? What's his age? That very day, because she was in the morning, wee hours of the morning, she called this domestic violence hotline. That very day, the caseworker showed up at her house. And she ended up losing her child to foster care for 5 years before she got him back. Wow. So this does happen. And so, it is harmful. Not only is it a gateway to having your children taken, read about the cases, they're exceptional, where children are extremely abused in homes and even killed in homes. That's what makes the headlines. And so we kind of have a sense that maybe there are more of those than there actually are. I mean, they're tragic, but they shouldn't govern our child welfare policy. We should try to prevent them. But in many of those cases, the mother in those cases herself was being abused and didn't get help. If she had a place to get help, I am convinced in many of the child fatalities, they would not have happened. And so not only can we prevent the family separation, but we could probably prevent a lot of the severe harms to children by having a system where people feel that they can go and get help without fear of some kind of punitive response. There's an organization, Survived and Punished. So many people who survive violence are then punished for it, punished for their very survival.
Right.
And so the first thing we need to do is stop mandated reporting. Stop the idea that people who are there to help are supposed to report, because that just deters people from getting the help they need. We need to get to the root causes. As I was saying in my talk, a lot of the way the child welfare system operates is this blame and accusation and separation without getting to the root cause of why we have these problems in families.
And what would you say is the root cause? Because there is federal and I believe state law that talks about that children can be removed for any other reasons than poverty.
Well, that's what they say. We know that those laws are not, it's the opposite. The main reason why children are removed is because of poverty. Poverty mixed with racism against Black and Native families. That can be in the words, but when the statute says that neglect is failing to meet a child's needs for housing, for clothing, for nutrition, for medical care, the main reason why parents fail to meet those needs is because of poverty. So you can come up with any other excuse you want, but that is the reason why. If they had the resources to meet their children's needs, whatever those resources might be, the actual housing or the actual medical care or the care for the parent. Maybe the parent needs high quality drug treatment. Maybe they need some kind of mental health care. But if they had all of that, they would meet their children's needs. It's very rare that a parent deliberately has the resources to meet their children's needs and deliberately just refuses to do it. Those are not the cases.
Right.
Those are not the cases. Those would be extremely rare. And again, we shouldn't have child welfare policy based on really rare cases that hardly ever happen. So it is because of poverty or because of the way in which child rearing is interpreted by the system. Again, another way of looking at it is, why is it that hardly any children in foster care are from wealthy families? You think it's because all wealthy parents are so caring for their children? They never neglect their children. They don't have children with problems. Read any memoir of a wealthy white movie star. There's one that's a bestseller now I'm glad my mom died. Okay, why is she glad her mom died? Because her mother taught her to be anorexic, taught her to starve herself. Everybody on the set of iCarly, she's the star of iCarly, everybody knew what the mother was doing. Nobody called Child Protective Services to take this girl away. Right. And I'll just tell one more story.
Sure.
And then I don't want to take up all the time. But when I gave a book talk at Harvard Bookstore last year, and a white Harvard student, young lady, came up to me and she said, you know, when I was growing up, my parents took me skiing every winter. And I was around all these wealthy white children. And every winter, all the parents would stay in the ski lodge drinking. They were all intoxicated. And we were out breaking our legs and arms on the ski slope. And she said that there was the most neglectful thing you could imagine. But it would never occur to any of us that our parents would be accused of child neglect and we'd be removed from our homes. You know, so it's both that poverty is the basis for most cases of accusations of child neglect, but also that the system is set up for impoverished people, especially if they're Black or Native, and it is not set up for middle class and wealthy people. It's just not a system for them. They are supposed to take care of their problems a different way, and their problems are not seen as making them unfit parents. Whereas if a Black mother in an impoverished neighborhood has problems with her children, problems with nutrition, problems with housing, problems with education, it is seen as unfitness. So it's the very way in which these are interpreted. And so when it comes to domestic violence, it's a combination of sexism, racism, and classism, disability, discrimination, all of this that comes into the way in which we treat survivors of domestic violence as if they're to blame and punish them instead of supporting them. And I just want to say one more thing, which I'm sorry, I promise I'm going to stop after this, which is really, it's important.
Dr. Roberts, we're going to give you 20 seconds.
Black community in particular, there are studies that show that for Black women, it is more dangerous to call the police. You are more likely to be killed later on if you call the police. And we don't know all the reasons why, but statistically it has been shown that carceral punitive approaches to domestic violence, intimate partner violence for Black women are especially dangerous. They're deadly. And we have to, again, imagine a better way of getting into why we live in such a violent society. Why we live. And I know that part of it is the traumas that we have experienced in our communities that produce violence. And we need to get to the root of that by healing, not by continuing these violent approaches to violence.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. We're definitely going to have Dr. Roberts back for how many of y'all will attend a half-day institute with Dr. Dorothy Roberts? Cool. We're going to do that. We're going to schedule that before we leave today. Now, Shireen White, the American Bar Association published an article. And let me just say this. I believe that both of you are supposed to be at the United Nations. Is it today?
Well, next week.
Next week, right. And you all were there last year testifying about the treatment, the disproportionality and the treatment that Black folks are having, or the overrepresentation of Black folks in foster care system across the nation. And so there was some follow-up that needs to happen, which is going to occur next week, where you all are going to testify. And let me just put a plug in. I want to go with y'all to the UN next year. Y'all go, brother. Because I got something I want to say. You know? But how many of you know that the United Nations has declared the overrepresentation of Black children, youth, and families involved in the United States foster care system as a human rights violation? See, that's the conversation that we need to be having in child welfare and in America. In other words, we're talking about criminal rights or the inhumane treatment of black folks. And see, the thing with child welfare is about how do we preserve and maintain and honor the humanity of black children, youth, and their families. And that's what this conference is about. But you wrote this article, right? And in the article, it's entitled, "Every day in the United States, black children are investigated by the child welfare system and forcibly separated from their parents at rates far higher than their white peers." What do you mean by forcibly? Real quickly, what do you mean by forcibly?
I know you want me to be quick.
Oh, no, go ahead.
First, I think this is on. I don't need this. I'm an attorney. I don't really need it.
That's okay, you're good.
I don't want to be too loud screaming at y'all. But first, I just want to go, because we keep framing it as disproportionality and overrepresentation of black children in the system. And those were conversations that were happening decades ago when Dr. Roberts was writing about Shattered Bonds, right? And we're way beyond that now. And the conversation should be about anti-black racism by the U.S. child welfare system. That's what we're talking about. So it goes deeper than that data, the disproportionality, because you're not going to ask for disproportionate representation of black children in the system, right? Like, that's not the answer. But if you frame it in that way, that's what people think the answer is. And so I just want to be clear that we're talking about anti-black racism more broadly than that.
Okay.
And
examples of forcibly being separated. Can you give us some examples? What you've seen?
Okay. So that goes back to this idea about civil rights in the U.S., right? And parents' rights being violated every day, children's due process rights being violated every day. And Dr. Roberts introduced and talked about this idea of Miranda rights for parents in the child welfare context, right? And so what happens when caseworkers go out and investigate, right? You just show up. You might not have a court order. They just knock on your door and they expect to walk into your home. And that's it. Parents don't know what to do. They have no idea what their rights are. They have no idea if they have to let them in. They don't know. And that's problematic, right? People have to know their rights. We live in the U.S. and it is 2023. And is the mic messing up?
Turn that one off, maybe.
Oh, turn this one off?
Or should, is this better?
Oh, yes, just one mic.
This one's out? Should I use that?
You have the other handheld.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here.
How you turn this off then?
We can just turn this off. I'm sorry.
Okay, y'all messed me up.
I'll grab
What I gotta go back to? And anyway, parents' rights are trampled upon every single day when those knocks happen, and we're not telling them. And that's what we mean by forcible separation. You just walking into people's houses and taking their kids, and they have no idea what just happened. And that's a problem. And you know, no one's asking for their kids to be taken away. And also another example of the forced separation is when we talk about this idea of calling for help, right? Or being reported if you ask for help, right? You're not asking for your children to be separated or removed from you or for that trauma to take place or your rights to be terminated. You're asking for help, right? And so, but yet we have instead responded with the forced separation of your children. And as Dr. Roberts started to talk about and tried to get into in her conversation earlier today, that's not new. That goes all the way back to slavery and enslaved children being forcibly separated from their parents, right, on a stage in the center of town. So none of that is new, and that trajectory continues.
How many of you have witnessed, or in your opinion, have seen the forcible separation of children who are involved in this? So just by show of hands. Okay. Now, let's talk about coercion. Dr. Dorothy Roberts, in your book on page 188, 189, and 200 part, you said their fate becomes focused on a list of tasks, a caseworker, compliance overshadows the child's needs or parent caregiving or even the truth of the original allegations of treatment. The issue is no longer whether the child will be safe at home, but whether the mother has attended every parenting classes, made every urine drop, participate in every therapy session, shown up for supervised, scheduled visits, arrived at every appointment on time, and always maintain a contrite and cooperative disposition. So let's talk about coercion. What do you mean by coercion? Real quickly, coercion. What does that look like?
So coercion is when you force somebody to comply with some dictate on threat of something bad happening to them. And that is how this system works. So once you're accused of child maltreatment, you're investigated, it's substantiated, and either your child is taken from you or you're threatened that if you don't do what we tell you to do, your children will be taken. So you have the threat of child removal. You have the threat that you're going to be separated from your children. To most parents, that is the worst thing that can happen to you.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is an extremely, extremely violent form of state intervention, taking someone's children from them. So whether the children are taken or whether you get to keep them, but only if you comply, you are now being coerced to fulfill these various tasks that the state gives you.
Is that the safety plans?
The safety plan or the service plan. I mean, the case plan.
Are those court order or volunteer? If the parent, if the mother or father does not sign that.
Okay, so there's two ways of doing it. One is, here's the plan, this is what you have to do. We're gonna tell you, you have to move your child out and live with this neighbor or relative, or maybe someone in the house has to move out. But you're given what's called a safety plan, a plan to keep your child safe, to supposedly cure whatever the allegation was of child abuse and neglect, or neglect. So you can supposedly voluntarily sign this. Well, again, is that voluntary? No, you're told if you don't sign this, we're going to court tomorrow. And the judge may terminate your parental rights eventually. So you're now at risk, if this is a court matter, of losing your children for a longer time or maybe permanently losing your children. And so you're, as Ms. White just said, you're terrified.
I like to
You're terrified.
For Dr. Roberts,
Yeah.
That's hidden foster care. So the
Right.
numbers we're giving you don't even include the data around hidden foster care, right? But that's what she's talking about.
Exactly.
And when we talk about the data, we're not even including those families.
That's
within
right.
that
That's right.
extended-
And those families might be the same number, 200,000 children who are moved from their homes because of these so-called voluntary safety plans. And again, we don't even know. But then there's the coercion of the court-enforced plan that says, parent, you must comply with this list of tasks or you will not get your children back or you may lose them to foster care. And as I mentioned in that quote that Jermaine Reed read, those tasks may have nothing to do with the allegation that got you in trouble with the child welfare system to begin with. It might be attend drug treatment programs, even though you don't have a drug problem. It may be it probably will be attend parent training classes, even though you don't need training, you need food, you need housing, right? You need clothing, you need medical care, but you gotta go to it probably includes various therapy sessions for you and your children. Your children could be scattered around the city or even in another city or state. You've got to attend visits with them, or else if you miss one, that shows you don't really care about your children. Now and you've got to cure whatever the problem was. So let's say you were in a homeless shelter, you gotta find housing. Let's say your child has a mental health problem, you gotta deal with that. So there are all of these forced tasks you have to comply with. And the reason why parents lose rights to their children permanently, termination of parental rights, isn't because of some finding that the child will be unsafe if they're returned to you, it's because you didn't comply with something. And it could just be one thing on that list, and a judge can rule you didn't comply, I'm terminating your parental rights.
So let's talk about coercion, psychiatric medication, and foster children. In the United States Government Accountability Office issued a report that found foster children were prescribed psychotropic drugs at a rate that's nearly 5 times higher than non-foster children, and in some states as high as 13 times. Foster children were also more than 9 times more likely than non-foster children to be prescribed drugs which there was no FDA recommended dose for their age. For the most vulnerable foster children, those less than 1 year old, foster children were nearly twice as likely to be prescribed a psychiatric drug compared to non-foster children. So when we look at this, medication in foster children and this interweaving of different systems that affect foster children. And Dr. DeGruy, I'm going to let you close us out real good. Hold on, because she's going to come through like lightning in a minute. But I want to talk about, foster children are oftentimes coerced into taking that medication, because if they don't take the medication, then their placement is going to disrupt. If they don't take the medication, the foster parent's going to say, well, I don't want to deal with them, or the teacher's going to say they have to get out of the class. So we're, like Dr. Wynn said, we're not treating the trauma, we're managing the behavior, right? So that's another example of coercion. Let's move to fraud. You brought up about representative payee and how governments, the state, child welfare, will take money and act as the representative payee for foster children to get their survivor benefits, their disability benefits, and the SSI benefit. And organizations will mine their school records, their case management records, looking for diagnoses to make them eligible for. Can you talk about that a little bit? That piece right there.
Yes, so this is very common. As the Marshall Project pointed out, most states in the nation participate in this kind of theft of children's benefits. And the U.S. Supreme Court has held it's constitutional. It was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court case. I don't know that we would want to try challenging it again under this Supreme Court, but it could be challenged at the state level. And some states have passed laws, Maryland included, that stop this practice. But it's the reason the Supreme Court upheld it is because it mistakenly agreed with this false idea that somehow the state is entitled to be reimbursed for the cost of caring for children, which they've taken from families. And that is not how it operates. And the other thing that's so infuriating about it is the way it's become this business. There's a whole cottage industry of these revenue maximization companies. And by the way, these companies often are companies that run whole foster care systems and run welfare systems, the welfare to work system. So they're making money off of Black people right and left. From welfare, they may be involved in prison systems as well as extracting money from incarcerated people. And this whole idea of taking money from impoverished people, the cities do it through fines. We learned about this when Michael Brown was killed, and we found out that Ferguson was involved in meeting its budget by pulling over Black people, charging them with fines and charging them with interest on the fines and putting them in jail and charging bail and all of this. And so I put it in conjunction with these other forms of extracting profits from impoverished people, especially impoverished Black people. A lot of people think that poor people don't have any money, so there's no way you could exploit them. But it's not just exploiting their labor. It's extracting every last penny that they have and then punishing them even more when they can't pay for it.
Dr. Roberts.
Yes.
Now, the foster care industry is we're talking about a $30 billion.
More than $30 billion, yes.
More than $30 billion in industry. So is there something fraudulent in your opinion, that the state would act as a payee representative with some fiduciary responsibilities and then not use the money directly to care for children, but put it in a general state coffer that the governor's cabinet or whomever can decide where they want to use that money, transportation, other areas. Is there something fraudulent in your mind about that?
You answered it.
Oh, did I?
Yes. It is. It's unconscionable. It's inhumane. It's a human rights violation to take this money and not spend it directly on the children. In the case, the name of the case is escaping me, but in that case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, the foster child's relative, I can't remember, it was a grandmother, I think it was his grandmother, had been saving that money for a college fund. And then the state started taking it away. And fortunately, she had saved enough that he could go to college. But had she not, and had he been one of these children who has the money taken right from the start, they end up with nothing. And so, yeah, it's fraudulent in the sense that they are taking money on the false claim that they're using it to benefit the children, but they're not. They're not. It's nothing more than stealing their money.
So the U.S. law defines human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, and coercion to compel a person into commercial sex acts or labor or services against their will.
He's building the case.
Am I building a case? Am I building a case here? Because we often talk about how foster care is an incubator or gateway to human trafficking.
I'm commending
I submit.
You.
Now, I'm not an attorney.
I was going to say, you would get A+ in law school.
That if we're dealing with fraud, say fraud, coercion, and force, that maybe we're not just a gateway to human trafficking, but maybe Uncle Sam
here we go.
is the biggest trafficker.
Yes.
So, moving right along.
Absolutely.
Dr. Joy DeGruy. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. She called me the other day. I got so nervous, so scared because something came up, and I just started praying. But let me say this. The American Academy of Pediatrics has said that family separation causes irreparable harm. Now, we're a trauma-informed community. So we say. I got that from you, Dr. Roberts. So when you've done this whole research on and post-traumatic slave syndrome, classic. If you haven't, then you need to go out in the hall and get all of their books. It's there. But family separation, let's talk about how that impacts children and the harm, the long-standing harm, that even when children are returned back home, sometimes they're in worse condition than they were before they were removed. Can you help us out?
Okay. First of all, I'm always, and I'm listening, and I'm first of all, I'm pleased to know that folks are leaning into this. I always look at the etiology of it. There's no, this concept of power and money is the root cause of everything. And people of color, particularly African American people, indigenous people, were commodified. We've always been perceived that way. And so we have this kind of a mythology around, slavery. Slavery ended, but then it didn't. You had peonage, unlawful selling of people back. And then you had, of course, Jim Crow, segregation. And then you had redlining. And then you had urban renewal. And then you had gentrification. And what that produces, what that's called, is serial forced displacement. Serial forced displacement results in interpersonal and structural violence. So you broke my leg, now you're complaining that I limp. Exactly. And so the etiology of all this is the foundation of every major institution in America, whether you're looking at science, medicine, media, law, education. the foundation is anti-blackness, white supremacy. And what we do is we look at the usual characters, and you say, well, the police, they're brutal. We know that it comes from slave patrols and trying to surveil black people because of a pathological fear of retaliation, that we would rise up. And in fact, that is what happened with white people. Hence, we have the Klan and what we saw at the Capitol. And so we have these, I always try to find what is the etiology, where does it start? And when we start looking at how we're perceived, right? So you have to ask the fundamental question, a large question, and that is, how could a country that upholds the notion of democracy and freedom engage in behaviors, establish institutions that are the antithesis of that? In other words, how does one reconcile oppressing and subjugating an entire group of people for hundreds of years and go to church on Sunday? So that becomes, for me, what are we doing to somehow legitimize this? And the way we legitimize it, because once you find justification, I'm going to actually answer that question. But this is only why I know how to get there.
Hey, do what you do.
So what happens then is I now have to find an approach that makes me feel okay. In other words, to remove the cognitive dissonance that shows up because I'm holding contradictory ideas. Freedom, democracy, send us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses, one nation under God, democracy. When you are killing indigenous people, committing genocide, and enslaving people of African descent for over 300 years, how does one reconcile the contradiction? And the way you do that is you justify it. How do you justify it? By all of these things that we create laws. It's almost like the smoke and mirrors, because we're going to justify all this by relabeling it, which means that there's something wrong with you, so it's your fault. And I remember reading years ago, the whole idea that black women couldn't be raped, right? Because we were inherently immoral. You see, once you put those things in place, what follows is, for example, 2016 study that was done, Yale Child Study. They took 123 pre-K teachers, asked them to look at a classroom and look at any potential problem that they might see. That was I want you to let us know any potential problem. Well, there were no problems. They deliberately set it up that way. And they didn't wait to see what button they pushed. They wanted to see the trajectory of their gaze. Where did they look? And when they saw where they looked at black children, and more specifically at black boys. So now let's unpack that for a moment. It wasn't just white teachers, because we've all been socialized to look at the black boy. Then they had two children off task doing the same off-task behavior, and they only saw the black child. So what we have to appreciate about what's going on is the way the system is set up is based on an ideology that says this is the white man's burden. And the white man's burden is we need to fix you people. We need to civilize you. And all of that, again, removes the cognitive dissonance. We're being benevolent. We're helping you, right? And so when we see those narratives and they come up over and over again, they fly in the face of everything we know. And so when we look at harm, when you look at what happens to a person when a child does not have secure attachment, any developmental chart that you see, first of all, black children are always more advanced. Any pediatrician will tell you, right? They'll say, well, he should be sitting up. He should be, holding the Bible. Child is making breakfast. What are you talking about, right? So the point is that what people see, and even in the face of science, right? What people see and are trained to see, and this is where we have to begin to look at every major institution. I say, you look at the police, you go, great. Do you think everyone at the Capitol was, they weren't wearing hoods? These were doctors, they were attorneys, they were teachers. Yeah. You see, and I have a whole battery of information around what's happening to our children. But I want to do something for a moment just to show you how deeply embedded these particular specific issues are and the harm it causes. I want you to close your eyes, and I'm going to give you a scenario. It's nighttime, and you're driving, or you may be a passenger. You look ahead and you see blinking lights, and as you approach, you see that it's police cars on either side of the road and one in the middle of the street. Beyond the police car is a yellow tape. Beyond the yellow tape are 3 young men. They don't have shirts on. They're on their knees, and their hands are handcuffed behind them. Now open your eyes. That image, I don't think it was 3 blonde-haired, blue-eyed boys. I just don't think so. But I can't make that call. But it is that image that continues to be produced over and over and over again in almost every setting in the United States. And it's seared into the minds of black children, indigenous children, white children. It's seared in our minds that that is the problem. Are you following me? So what we have to start looking at, do a hard look at that and understand the harm that is produced when a person sees and continues to see themselves as an aberration, themselves as the problem. Look at all the terms, underprivileged, all at risk. All of those terms, and what that narrative that keeps getting taught over and over again is injurious to everyone. And most of all, to children themselves, right? One of the things that I always do, especially when I'm working with African-American families, if I were to ask every black parent in this room, their child comes home from school, it could be elementary school, middle school, high school, they have a D on their report card. Parent goes, why did you get a D? The child says, it's because my teacher doesn't
like me.
Why don't we listen to them? Because they don't. And our children, and I'm not saying that because it's my opinion, our children can read behavior earlier than the charts say they can. Pre-verbal, they can read whether you're being sincere, but they cannot articulate that need, right? So the harm, it starts very, very early. Right?
Yes,
and we start teaching our children. A very good example of that, and I talk about this, but the whole idea that if there is a black child in a bank, in a social service, anywhere they are out there publicly, there's a black parent. Let's say they're in a bank and they're getting ready to go up to speak to the teller. The children are 3, 2, 4, that range. Where are those children in proximity of that mother? Holding on sometimes. Everybody moving together. And then, right. Now, let's be appreciative that this is 2023. Same bank. You have white children. They rolling down the aisle, coming up to you. How you doing? God, I like your sweater. What's your name? Right? Meanwhile, the black children, stay with me because there's a reason. Because what you pointed out was there's a lack of trust. Right? And I say trust in God, but tie your camel. Because what's happening is I may be paranoid, but I have a history of people following me. So when we start looking at that and we understand Emmett Till, all of those reasons, that's why the child, get over here. Not only that, there's another social control. The child is looking at the white child. All the children are innocent. The white child looks at the black child and goes, gosh, something must be wrong with them. They can't move. And the black child, because this is a normal human developmental response to being a child, to move and explore with safety and autonomy. That's an important developmental phase. But they are now ashamed, fearful, and angry. And they are trying to meet the task of development. They're trying to meet it because it's a normal task of development. So the mother gets to the counter. Now the counter is, higher than the children. So they're underneath the counter trying to escape. Rolling down, sliding down. Mother is preoccupied. But there's another black person in the line. Doesn't know the mother, doesn't know the child, but knows the death stare. And the child just, oh, geez, rolling back. So that's another social control. But you see, all the time we're protecting the child, but are we? But are we? Because those are the things that get internalized when I feel like I'm not safe to be a child. Right? So now if you take a parent away from a child, that's exponentially causing the stressors and the harm. So I think for me, I'm always looking at in every major institution. We can't stop with child welfare. We got to look at every major institution.
Absolutely.
The dentist. I'm just saying.
Yeah,
we don't know if they go to Klan meetings on Wednesdays. You know what I'm saying? You really don't.
You know, thanks a lot. Give Dr. Joy DeGruy a round of applause. You know, I do think that the challenge, you know, in helping systems understand that we are human and that our journey and our experience coming to America is like no other person's, and that there's a difference between immigration policy and importation policy.
That's right.
So we're the only people in this country, our folks, who have been imported into this country. So we gotta go eat. But wait a minute, I wanna get two people to ask questions. Yes, you better come on, come on, come on. You can come right here, yeah. Because we wanna eat now, we gotta eat.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eunice. I don't have a question, but I do have a statement. And I'm not surprised about the number of children on medication in foster care, because I don't know if everybody knows this, is that when a prescription is filled,
That's right.
the doctor gets a kickback.
That's right.
So it's a money opportunity, so I always say, follow the money.
That's right. Not only that, I wanted to say something. In the state of California, this literally happened, and I couldn't believe it, but they would give a check to a family if their child was on medication. So guess what started happening? Parents started putting, especially poor families. They interviewed this family, and she said, well, we were going to be evicted, and it don't hurt them. So she put her son on a medication because there's an extra check that follows that. You're absolutely right. Follow the money, and you'll follow it all the way through to the pathology.
Good morning. My name is Amada Morales. I'm a local Native activist here, and I accompany parents to court for 13 years. And my question is, how do we get this research into the courtrooms? Because we see that this research that's copy and pasted, that DV causes teen pregnancy, homicide, suicide. But when are we going to start hearing the best interest of the child is not to have them adopted in 15 months, is not to separate the child from their family and tell them that their family's not good enough? How is that good to the child, and how do we get that into the courtroom?
Thanks a lot, Amanda. Anybody want to respond?
Maybe here, but yeah,
I mean, we're working on it. That's the work right now, right? Is to move toward repealing, amending all of those laws and policies that are on the books that result in the harm that we're talking about. So that's the work being done, and it's happening on local levels and local communities and on a national stage. And so, link up with other people who are doing that work right now.
Yes, sir.
That may not work, but so for anyone, but I guess for Dr. DeGruy, the root sometimes can be dependent upon perspective, right? So sequentially, I want to start with, we've bought into race-based identity, race-based history, race-based culture. I mean, that is everything that I hear you say. And one part of the bypass is that white bodies have not understood the trauma that they have gone through once. So as you mentioned, right, before there was a kidnapped, enslaved African body, white bodies were running from persecution, and through these justifications and laws, they got to blow that trauma through other bodies, right? And so in your book, you write about preeminence, relationship preeminence, right? And I'm going to get to the question, but this is the only way I know how to get to it. And so what would, in sum, right? If we didn't use all these things as bypasses, right, to escape the conversation about race, knowing that racism predates race, right? What would, in your opinion, a third Reconstruction look like for us as Americans?
First of all, one of the things I wanted to point out when you said that, we talked about you said the preeminence of relationships. 85-year Harvard study, they just actually a few months ago published that after looking at families over 85 years, they said, what is a cause of happiness? And they said, healthy, secure relationships. That is the answer. I think that when we start looking at the Reconstruction, what we have to recognize, in my opinion, is our essential oneness as a humanity. If we don't get to that notion that we are 99.99% the same as human beings, it will mean the undoing of America. If we don't get to that, as we're having this conversation, you know, and this is the other thing we need to say. One, parents, you have power. You have power and you have a voice. If it's driven by money, we can talk about that. I don't know if y'all know what's going on in Florida. I don't know if you know the NAACP put the travel warning, right? Now we understand how this country affected apartheid in South Africa, right? And they said, we ain't gonna do Sun City. We may not need to do Florida. And what I'm saying here is that collectively, it is a collective voice that's gonna change this. It's not gonna be, division is what produced it. So the only thing I think that can bring us back is a spiritual principle, the essential oneness of humankind.
Ladies, I appreciate you all so much for everything that you have shared. You have been amazing and how you have kind of really, you know, laid this out for us. I too wrote a book called Aged Out, Narratives of Young Women Who Grew Up in Out-of-Home Care. And so I interviewed 8 young ladies who had lived in group homes and foster homes for a period of time and talked about sibling bonds being broken and some of the things and the things that they experienced in the home and things they experienced in different providers, caregivers' homes. And I do think as systems, we need to come up with a way, how can all of the systems, I own 3 group homes for teenage girls, and in a way to say, how can I help parents, started a social services agency where I started to now, after 16 years of group home, work with these girls, decided how can I help the parents? So now we have an agency that offers anger management and supervised visitation and the millions of services they want the parents to do to get those kids back. But what system, who needs to be at the table? Law enforcement, child welfare, licensing, colleges and universities. How can we create that so that we can all foster better outcomes for our kids and families?
Yeah, all of that. All of that. And one way is the organizing that system-impacted parents and youth are doing. I think, as everyone has said, and you just said, parents have power. And one way of showing that power is through the organizing that's going on. I always shout out Joyce McMillan, JMAC for Families in New York City, a mother whose 2 daughters were taken from her, and she got them back, and then she founded an organization that's doing fantastic legislative work and also community organizing. And we need to come together in that way, organizing together across these systems, recognizing all the connections, the entanglements that they have. And the beauty of that is not that then it seems, oh my goodness, we're up against so much. You know, the police and the prisons and child welfare and education and medical care, they're all entangled together. But that also means that our movements that are fighting the injustices in them and fighting to abolish them and the way and their way of thinking, that we can all come together to form a stronger force to reimagine how we want our society to work and to start building and keep building it right now. Yeah.
Just, I think it's important to say that when you come together collectively in the community, you're not coming with the mindset of improving that system or how to make it better. Don't like work within the framework that we've been handed, right? Like you're coming together to really think beyond about what we would create if we were creating something that's gonna help our children and help our people. And so I think that is a really important task to think about. And
so we're on our lunchtime.
Yeah, we are.
So, but wait. We want to give her the opportunity to ask a question or make a statement real quickly, and then we're going to transition, because next up is Dr. Michael Eric Dyson.
My question's fast. I don't know about the answer. My question was, is the Family First Act a step in the right direction, or what she would be advocating for next?
Right.
I can say something quickly about it. As Shireen was just saying, the Family First Act is a way of trying to fix all the problems in the system, many of the problems that we've identified. It is not a radical change in how we keep children safe, support our families and communities. And so, just to give an example, the idea that under the Family First Act of preventive services. Preventive services is when you identify families that have already been threatened with getting their children taken from them. It focuses on families that are identified as at risk of being put in foster care. And then those services are within the system. So everything we've been talking about, the coercion, the force, the harm, the threats, all of that is maintained in Family First. Again, I think what we're all trying to say, you have to uproot
Come on.
the foundations which are in white supremacy and anti-black racism. We have to, and hatred of poor people, people with disabilities, blaming them for not being able to manage. I like what you said, we'll break your leg and then we'll blame you for limping. Which reminded me of Malcolm X and what Malcolm X said, right?
What did he say?
And what I put up on the... I have no compassion for a society that will crush you and then punish you for not being able to bear the weight.
Absolutely.
So that's the same.
Family First, though. On the other side of Family First, the preventive part, but then on the other side, they said, well, we're going to stop putting kids in congregate settings. And so you're going to lose state funding if you keep kids in congregate settings. But what did they do? They built up other congregate settings, qualified residential treatment programs.
Wow.
So now we're gonna put them instead in a qualified residential treatment program. And now, because of the name, they're gonna get the treatment and services that they need, right? So we haven't stopped anything.
All
We've
right.
created a new way of doing it.
How many of y'all would do a half a day of this? If we bring this back, absolutely. I promise you, we're gonna do this really soon. Come on, let's give them a thunderous round of applause. Dr. Joy DeGruy, Dr. Dorothy Roberts, and Shireen White, thank you so much for this so in-depth, informed conversation. Now listen, we're gonna transition to the event center where we're at this morning and get ready to eat and listen to Dr. Michael Eric Dyson.